This is a disaster. Where's the interpreter? Richard Hale's voice cut through the lobby like broken glass. The 55-year-old general manager stood rigid, sweat beading along his temple as he glared at his young assistant. She was confirmed from UCLA, sir, but she cancelled this morning, the assistant stammered, clutching his iPad like a shield. Richard's face darkened. You had one job. One. Do you have any idea who just walked through those doors? The sliding glass panels parted, and all conversation in the lobby slowed to a hush. A woman in a tailored navy suit stepped inside, her stride unhurried but commanding. CEO Akiyama Reiko, head of a Japanese tech empire, adjusted the cuffs of her jacket. At 48, she carried herself with an elegance that didn't need announcing. She spoke softly to her aide in Japanese. The assistant manager froze, unable to respond. The silence was deafening. Richard hissed under his breath. She's Takata's heir. The entire deal hinges on her feeling respected, and right now, we look like amateurs. To make matters worse, 3 American investors entered behind her, their Rolexes catching the light. They exchanged smirks like boys in a locker room. One leaned in, loud enough for the marble walls to carry his words. She can't even speak English. How's she a billionaire? The others chuckled, phones angled discreetly, recording the humiliation. Reiko's eyes stayed calm, but her silence grew heavier by the second. Richard's jaw twitched. The entire lobby felt like it was collapsing in slow motion. Then, a quiet voice broke the chaos. I can help. Head snapped toward the far corner. A young black man in an orange janitor's uniform was polishing the glass near the elevators. Malik Carter, 22, rolled his sleeve higher, rag still in hand. His dark curls were tied back neatly, his posture humble, but his gaze steady. Richard barked, Not now. Stay in your lane. But Malik didn't flinch. He looked straight at Reiko, then bowed slightly with a precision no textbook could teach. When he spoke again, the words flowed in flawless Japanese. Sumimasen, Akiyama-sama. Please allow me to assist. The lobby froze. Investors exchanged shocked glances. The billionaire's eyes widened, just enough to betray surprise. A janitor had just spoken his language, perfectly, and for the first time that morning, the balance of power shifted. Not your place, boy. Get back to your mop. Richard Hale's words cracked like a whip across the marble lobby. The investors smirked, satisfied. The assistant shifted uncomfortably. Even the bellhop froze in place, pretending not to listen, but hearing every syllable. Malik Carter didn't move. His rag still hung from his hand, but the weight of Richard's insult pressed harder than the mop in his cart. His chest rose once, steady. His gaze turned toward Reiko Akiyama, who stood in the center of the EA, storm, elegant, unreadable, and alone. For a heartbeat, Malik thought about stepping back, about folding into the invisibility the uniform guaranteed. But then he saw the billionaire's eyes, sharp, intelligent, silently cataloguing every slight. And Malik stepped forward. Hey! Richard snapped, blocking his path. I said back off. Don't start something you can't finish. Malik bowed his head slightly, not to Richard, but to Reiko. And then, in a voice calm enough to slice through the static of humiliation, he spoke again in Japanese. Akiyama-sama, please forgive the confusion. If you allow, I will translate. The words rolled smooth, practiced, lived in, the kind of fluency that couldn't be faked. The air cracked, every phone lowered, every whisper stopped. Reiko blinked once. Slowly, she adjusted her pearl earring and then, unexpectedly, she bowed. A deep, deliberate gesture of acknowledgement. The investors' smirks faltered. Respect had entered the room, and it hadn't come from them. Richard's face burned crimson. What the hell are you doing? She doesn't need a janitor making a scene. He hissed the word janitor like it was dirt on his tongue. But Reiko straightened and answered him, Not in English, but in Japanese. Her voice was low, melodic, and unmistakably clear. Malik understood instantly. "I will hear him." Malik lifted his head. His bow had been answered. A bridge had been built. "Wait," Richard sputtered, turning to the investors. "You don't actually believe this?" One of the Americans leaned back in his chair. "Seems like he's the only one here who understands her." Richard's jaw tightened. He turned back to Malik, his voice trembling with fury. "You screw this up, and it's my head." "Do you hear me?" "My head." Malik finally met his eyes. "Then maybe you should have listened when she asked weeks ago." His tone was respectful, but the edge cut deep. A ripple ran through the lobby. Staff exchanged looks. Someone stifled a gasp. Reiko's aide handed Malik a document. He scanned it quickly, then translated for Richard with calm precision. "She says she informed the hotel of her requirements long before arriving. She is disappointed, but willing to proceed if treated with dignity." The translation landed like a hammer. The investors whispered among themselves. Richard's lips parted, but no excuse came. Reiko's gaze lingered on Malik. There was no smile, no grand gesture, just the smallest nod, a silent agreement that he had stepped across an invisible line and been met with respect instead of ridicule. The janitor had spoken. The billionaire had bowed, and everyone else in the lobby now knew silence was no longer an option. Richard Hale's mouth hung open. He had expected Malik to stumble, to fake it, to embarrass himself in front of everyone. But the janitor's voice never wavered. Every syllable he spoke in English carried the weight of Reiko Akiyama's intent. "She says," Malik translated evenly, "she informed the hotel weeks ago of her language requirements. She is disappointed but willing to proceed, if treated with dignity." The words settled over the lobby like dust after an explosion. Investors shifted uncomfortably. The assistant clutched his iPad tighter, eyes darting. Richard blinked hard, his throat working for an excuse, but none came. Reiko's gaze lingered on Malik, calm, measuring, almost searching. Then she spoke again in Japanese, a string of quiet syllables. Malik bowed and translated. "She requests to be escorted to her suite." For once, Richard had no choice but to nod. "Fine," he muttered, gesturing toward the elevators. "Take her up." His tone dripped with defeat, but he didn't dare push further. Malik stepped ahead, bowing lightly. Reiko followed, her aide a step behind. Together they entered the gilded elevator. The mirrored doors slid shut, sealing them off from the chaos below. The world shifted. The noise of the lobby fell away, replaced by a hush thick enough to press against the skin. The elevator hummed softly, numbers glowing gold as they ticked upward. Reiko stood composed, hands folded neatly before her. Malik remained 2 steps to the side, his posture respectful, his eyes lowered, but the silence between them was alive. At last, she turned slightly, her reflection catching his in the mirror. Her voice, soft but deliberate, broke the stillness, Japanese again. "Where did you learn our language?" Malik hesitated. He hadn't expected the question. He lifted his eyes, careful, steady. "I lived in Kyoto." From age 7 until 17. Katsura District. Reiko's brows lifted, just barely. For the first time since entering the hotel, her composure cracked, not in weakness, but in curiosity. She studied him more closely, as if the uniform no longer told the full story. "You were taught well," she said. Malik bowed slightly. "I was raised by people who believed silence carries meaning. That to listen is more important than to speak." A flicker moved through her eyes, suspicion, then recognition. In that instant, her perception shifted. The janitor wasn't a novelty or a desperate staffer playing hero. He was someone who had lived where she lived, someone who carried pieces of Kyoto in his bones. The elevator ticked upward past the 20th floor. Reiko's gaze held his, no longer shielded by formality. "You understand," she murmured. "That language is not just words." Malik's voice dropped, quiet, almost reverent. "It's the silence between them." For a heartbeat, time slowed. The mirrored walls reflected two figures from worlds apart, yet in the silence, they stood on equal ground. Reiko inclined her head, the smallest of nods, but one filled with weight. It was not thanks, it was acknowledgement, respect. When the elevator chimed at the 28th floor, the spell broke. The doors slid open, revealing thick carpet and walnut-paneled walls, glowing under muted light. Malik stepped aside, bowing deeply. "Your suite is ready, Akiyama-sama," he said in Japanese. Reiko passed him, her footsteps deliberate, the faintest shift in her expression lingering like an unspoken promise. As the doors closed behind her, Malik remained inside, hands folded in front of him. His heart still thundered, but his face was calm. For the first time in years, he had spoken his truth in the open, and someone powerful had listened. The walnut-paneled doors of the executive office slammed shut. Richard Hale stood behind his desk, arms crossed, jaw tight. The skyline glowed behind him, but his eyes burned only with fury. Malik Carter stood across from him, cap in his hands, uniform still dusted from the lobby's chaos. Richard didn't waste time. His voice came low, sharp, and venomous. "You embarrassed me out there." "Do you understand? In front of investors, in front of her. You're a janitor, nothing more." The words landed heavy, but Malik didn't flinch. He clasped his cap tighter, his knuckles pale. "You think speaking a few fancy words makes you important?" Richard pressed. "It doesn't. What you did wasn't help. It was insubordination. You stepped into a room you weren't invited into. And around here, that gets people fired." Silence stretched. Malik's chest rose and fell, slowly, like he was weighing each word before speaking. His voice, when it came, was quiet, almost respectful. She wasn't being heard. I could understand her. That's all I did. Richard's laugh was cold, without humor. "That's all? You hijacked $100 million deal to play hero. Don't mistake her nod for protection. When this deal collapses, nobody will remember your bow. They'll remember that you overstepped." He reached into a folder, sliding a paper across the desk. The header glared in bold letters. Suspension notice. "You're on administrative hold, effective immediately. One more step out of line, and you're finished here. No recommendation, no references. Just a stain on your record." Malik looked down at the paper. His reflection stared back from the glossy surface, tired but unbroken. Slowly, he lifted his eyes to Richard. "I clean your floors, sir. But I don't need your permission to respect someone." Richard's jaw tightened, his hand slamming down on the desk. "Don't test me." Malik folded the notice carefully, slid it into his pocket, and turned toward the door. At the threshold, he paused, not defiant, but steady. "You said I'm nothing more than a janitor," he said quietly. "Maybe that's true in your eyes. But sometimes the person holding the mop is the only one who sees the dirt." The words hung in the air like smoke. Richard's face darkened, but he said nothing. The door clicked shut behind Malik. Down the hall, fluorescent lights buzzed above him. His steps were measured, shoulders squared. The suspension notice pressed against his chest like a brand, but his eyes told another story. Not defeat, not surrender. A quiet resolve, the kind that grows sharper under pressure. He wasn't finished, not yet. High above Los Angeles, silence wrapped itself around the 28th floor suite. The city glowed beneath the window like a restless sea of lights. Inside, CEO Reiko Akiyama sat cross-legged at a low table, a sheet of rice paper unfurled before her. She dipped a brush into black ink and let the bristles hover for a moment. Then, with deliberate strokes, she began to paint. A bamboo grove emerged, slender stalks bending but never breaking. Each line carried memory. Kyoto, the quiet gardens where she learned stillness, the lessons of her father. Respect begins with listening. But tonight, the image of a janitor bowing in perfect silence pressed itself into her thoughts. His words, his cadence. It was not mimicry. It was lived. Her brush hesitated. The ink pooled darkly, spreading like a thought she could not contain. A soft knock broke the stillness. The door opened a fraction, and Kenji Mori, her longtime aide, stepped inside. His tablet was tucked beneath his arm, his posture respectful. "Forgive the intrusion," he said quietly in Japanese. Reiko didn't look up. "What is it?" Kenji hesitated, then moved closer. His voice dropped to a more personal register. "The janitor, Malik Carter." The brush paused mid-stroke. Kenji continued, cautious but sincere. "He is different. I watched him in the lobby. He did not hesitate. His bow was exact, his words precise. He carries himself with humility, but not ignorance." Reiko finally set the brush down. A faint trace of ink smeared her fingers. "Different," she repeated softly. Kenji nodded. "In this city, most see status before character, but he noticed what even trained interpreters often miss." The silence. He moved when no one else dared. Reiko rose gracefully, walking toward the wide window. The skyline glittered, indifferent and endless. She folded her arms, gaze sharp yet distant. "Sometimes," she said in English now, her accent light but deliberate, "the most overlooked person holds the sharpest eyes." Kenji inclined his head. "Do you wish me to investigate him further?" Reiko considered. "Not yet. Observation first. A seed does not reveal its strength until pressure tests its roots." She turned back toward the table. The unfinished bamboo swayed on the page, ink still drying. She lifted the brush again, her hand steady this time. Kenji watched quietly. He knew her well enough to understand what this meant. She was intrigued, an emotion she rarely allowed herself in negotiations. "Prepare tomorrow's schedule," she said softly, returning to Japanese, "and ensure, Mr. Carter is not discarded too quickly." Kenji bowed. "Of course." When the door closed behind him, Reiko exhaled slowly. Her dossier. Eyes lingered on the ink strokes, each one a fragment of memory and possibility. The janitor's face returned to her mind, the certainty in his bow, the quiet defiance in his voice. Not arrogance, not ambition, something else. Respect. Reiko's lips curved just slightly, the ghost of a smile. For the first time since landing in Los Angeles, she felt the faint stirrings of trust, not in contracts, not in titles, but in someone no one else had seen, and that, she thought, might change everything. The mahogany doors of Conference Room B swung shut with a muted thud. A long table gleamed under soft lights, lined with polished leather chairs. On one side sat 3 American investors, suits crisp, eyes sharp. At the head, Victor Lang, silver hair, Rolex glinting, smile just a little too smug. On the other side, Reiko Akiyama, composed as ever, with Kenji quietly typing notes beside her. And then, Malik Carter. His orange janitor's uniform stood out like a beacon in the sea of navy and charcoal. He kept his hands folded, shoulders squared, eyes steady. The tension was immediate. Victor's voice cut through the room. "Why is the janitor here?" The words dropped like stones. The other investors exchanged smirks. Richard Hale, standing near the door like a watchdog, shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. Reiko didn't blink. She spoke in Japanese, her tone smooth. "Because I requested him." Malik translated calmly, his accent crisp. The investors stared, realization dawning that he wasn't just decoration. Victor leaned back, scoffing. "We flew halfway across the world to negotiate, and you bring in hotel staff. This is a joke, Reiko replied in Japanese again, this time with a faint steel in her voice. Malik translated, unshaken. She says truth does not care about uniforms. Only accuracy. The silence that followed was heavier than any rebuttal. Kenji slid a folder across the table. Clause 6, he said quietly. Malik opened it. His eyes moved quickly, first across the Japanese version, then the English. His brow furrowed. He lifted his head. There is a difference, he said firmly. Victor frowned. Difference? Malik read aloud from the Japanese. Intellectual property rights remain the sole ownership of Akiyama Innovations. He flipped to the English text. Intellectual property rights shall be jointly managed under the operating agreement, with oversight by U.S. partners. The words hit like a gavel. The room froze. One of the American investors coughed, eyes darting to his papers. Richard Hale's jaw clenched. Victor's face darkened. That's a standard translation variation. No, Malik said, steady. It's deliberate. The meaning is changed. Ownership versus control. That is not a mistake. He looked directly at Victor, his voice low but cutting. In one version, miss, Akiyama keeps her technology. In the other, she loses it. Reiko's gaze flicked toward him. Not surprise, but confirmation. She had seen it too. She just needed someone else to call it out. Victor shifted in his chair, lips curling into a tight smile. You're telling me a janitor is suddenly a legal expert? Malik didn't flinch. I'm telling you, I know the difference between respect and theft. For a moment, the room buzzed with nothing but the hum of the air vents. Then Reiko spoke again, her words like silk over steel. Malik translated with perfect clarity. She says this meeting will continue only in the presence of those who value truth. If not, there is nothing to discuss. The threat hung in the air. The investors stiffened. Even Victor couldn't disguise the twitch in his jaw. Kenji typed rapidly, recording every word. Finally, Victor forced a laugh, shallow and brittle. Fine, continue. Let's not get hung up on semantics. But the power in the room had already shifted. Reiko's eyes softened just slightly as they flicked toward Malik. Not gratitude, not yet. Something subtler. Recognition. He bowed his head in return, silent but resolute. From the corner, Richard Hale's fists tightened at his sides. He saw what was happening. A janitor had just outmaneuvered men who measured their worth in millions. And the meeting had only just begun. The boardroom air was razor-sharp. Papers lay scattered, pens forgotten, and every eye turned toward the one man who shouldn't have been there. Malik Carter stood tall in his janitor's uniform, sleeves rolled, palms steady on the polished wood. His voice cut through the silence, low but unflinching. I mop floors, yes, but today I clean the lies too. Gasps broke around the table. A few investors shifted uncomfortably. Others stared, waiting for someone to silence him. Richard Hale lunged forward, his face blotched crimson. Enough! You're out of line. You don't belong in this room, and you never will. He snatched at the folder in front of Malik, but Malik calmly slid it out of reach, his gaze locked on Victor Lang. The clause was changed, Malik repeated firmly, and you hoped no one would notice. But I did. Richard's voice cracked with fury. You're a janitor, nothing more. You're here because of charity, not merit. Don't mistake sweeping floors for saving companies. Malik didn't flinch. His eyes stayed level. Then why are you afraid of my words? The challenge echoed, slicing through Richard's authority like glass shattering. Victor tried to interject, laughter forced and hollow. This is absurd. We don't conduct billion-dollar deals based on janitors' opinions. But Reiko Akiyama spoke for the first time in English, her voice steady, each syllable deliberate. If he leaves, I leave. The room froze. Victor blinked. Excuse me? Reiko's gaze swept across the table, calm yet unyielding. You asked why he is here. Because he saw what none of you would admit. That makes him more valuable than all the titles you hide. Behind Kenji, seated beside her, typed the words, verbatim, his keystrokes deliberate. This was no passing remark. It was record. Richard sputtered. You can't be serious. You'd walk away from this deal over him? Reiko's expression didn't waver. Over truth. Without truth, there is no deal. Whispers rippled through the boardroom. One investor leaned toward another. She's siding with the janitor. The other shook his head slowly, unsettled. Malik bowed slightly to Reiko, then turned back to the room. His words came quiet, measured, each one landing heavier than the last. I never asked to be in this room. But when I see lies, I don't stay silent, because silence is how dignity dies. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the faint buzz of the projector still humming on the wall. Victor finally exhaled, leaning back in his chair. Fine. He stays. But remember this. When he fails, so does your credibility. Reiko's reply was immediate. Then I am willing to risk it. Richard's fists tightened, but he couldn't answer. The ground had shifted beneath him, and he knew it. Malik gathered the papers calmly, his expression unreadable. He didn't gloat. He didn't smile. He only stood straighter, as if the weight of the room no longer pressed him down but lifted him up. In that moment, the janitor wasn't invisible anymore. He was undeniable. The boardroom battle had barely cooled before Richard Hale and Victor Lang cornered each other in the executive lounge. The door clicked shut, muffling the city's glow beyond the glass. Richard's voice was sharp, laced with humiliation. She humiliated me in front of every investor because of him. A janitor. If we don't end this, we lose control. Victor swirled the scotch in his glass, his smirk thin and cold. Control isn't lost until we decide it is. You want this problem gone? Suspend him. Make it official. Housekeeping staff are disposable. No one fights for them. Richard hesitated, his pride bruised. Reiko will fight. Victor leaned in, eyes glinting. Then make it look like procedure. HR, protocols, paperwork. By the time she realizes, it'll be too late. He'll be branded insubordinate, unstable. One stroke of a pen, and he's history. Down in the administrative wing, fluorescent lights hummed. Claudia Miles, Director of Human Resources, sat behind her cluttered desk when Richard stormed in, folder in hand. Draft it, he barked, slamming the papers down. Suspension notice. Effective immediately, Claudia adjusted her glasses, scanning the file. Malik Carter, housekeeping. Charge, insubordination, unauthorized access to restricted areas, interference in executive meetings. Her brow furrowed. Richard, this doesn't hold. He was invited by Miss Akiyama. You're asking me to suspend someone for doing what she allowed. Richard's jaw tightened. Don't make this complicated. He embarrassed. The board he crossed lines he had no right to cross. And if you won't sign it, Victor will make sure the parent company hears you defended insubordination. Claudia's throat went dry. She'd seen this playbook before. She wanted to push back, to say what was right. But her job, her mortgage, her family weighed on her shoulders like chains. She nodded faintly. I'll process it. Richard snatched the file back. Do it today. I want him out by morning. Hours later, Malik was called into HR. The hallway smelled faintly of bleach and coffee, the same mix he'd known for years. Claudia sat across from him, her hands folded tight. She couldn't quite meet his eyes. Malik, she said softly, sliding the paper across the desk. This is a formal notice. You're suspended pending review. He stared at the words, the letters blurring for a moment. Suspended, he repeated quietly. Claudia swallowed. I'm sorry. It isn't fair, but my hands are tied. Malik didn't argue. He just folded the paper carefully, placed it back on the desk, and stood. His voice was calm, almost too calm. Fair left this place a long time ago. He walked out without another word. That night, in his small apartment on the city's south side, Malik sat alone at the kitchen table. The suspension notice lay under the weak yellow light of the lamp. He traced the letters slowly, like they were carved into his skin. His reflection in the window showed a man in a janitor's uniform, but in his memory he saw someone else. His father, a broad-shouldered man with calloused hands, standing outside a half-built construction site. The day the foreman tossed him aside for daring to demand safety harnesses for the crew. "You fight for what's right," his father had said that night, voice steady even as his pride was in pieces. "But understand, son, fighting doesn't mean you win. It just means you don't kneel." Malik closed his eyes. That memory burned now, sharper than ever. He hadn't knelt then. He wouldn't now. Back at the hotel, whispers spread like wildfire. Staff traded glances in the laundry room, the cafeteria, the service hallways. They suspended him. For standing up for her? Doesn't matter. He's a janitor. They'll bury him. But in a corner booth of the cafeteria, Claudia sat silently, her hands trembling around a cup of coffee. She had signed the paper, but the guilt gnawed. Malik's quiet dignity haunted her, and she knew this wasn't the end. It was the opening of a war. The suspension notice still burned in Malik's pocket like a brand. The following morning, he clocked in anyway. HR hadn't yet deactivated his badge. He pushed his cleaning cart down the narrow 7th-floor hallway, trying to lose himself in the rhythm of folded towels, polished mirrors, the steady scrape of his mop. But his mind refused silence. Every swipe of glass reminded him of Richard's sneer. "You're a janitor, nothing more." Every chemical sting in the air recalled his father's calloused hands, thrown aside for daring to stand tall. His phone buzzed against his hip. Unknown number. He froze. For a moment he considered ignoring it. Nothing good came from calls at this hour. Still, he answered. "Malik Carter." The voice was calm, precise, Japanese accent. "Yes, who's this?" "This is Kenji Sato, assistant to Ms. Akiyama Reiko." Malik straightened instinctively, his hand tightening on the mop handle. "Kenji, why are you calling me?" "Miss, Akiyama requests your presence, immediately. Conference room, A, 28th floor." Malik's chest tightened. I can't. I've been suspended. If I show up there, I'll be fired on the spot." Kenji's voice didn't change. "She insisted." Her exact words. "Tell him it is not an option. It is a request." The line clicked dead. Malik stood frozen in the silent hallway, the hum of fluorescent lights loud in his ears. His reflection in the polished brass elevator doors looked back at him, uniform wrinkled, gloves stuffed in his belt, eyes shadowed with fatigue. "If I go, I lose my job." The thought stabbed sharp and clear. His rent, his younger sister's tuition, his mother's medicine, all tied to the paycheck he earned mopping floors. But another thought rose, heavier. If I stay, I betray myself, and I betray her. He remembered Reiko's bow in the lobby, the moment she returned respect where none was given. He remembered her eyes in the elevator, sharp, searching, softening when she realized he spoke her language. That was not pity, that was trust. His father's voice whispered from memory. "Fighting doesn't mean you win. It means you don't kneel." Aldas Malik looked down at his hands, roughened by bleach and labor, but steady. Then he pulled off his gloves, dropped them on the cart, and turned toward the stairwell. The climb to the 28th floor felt like walking a tightrope with no net. Each flight of stairs pressed heavier on his chest. At one landing, he stopped, leaning on the railing, whispering under his breath, "Am I brave or just stupid?" But his feet kept moving. By the time he reached the frosted glass doors of the executive wing, his pulse was a drumbeat in his ears. 2 suited guards eyed him suspiciously. "Staff level ends downstairs," one said curtly. Before Malik could answer, Kenji appeared, tablet in hand. His bow was subtle but unmistakable. "He's expected." The guard stepped aside. Malik exhaled slowly and followed. Conference room was a world away from mop buckets and bleach, mahogany table, leather chairs, windows framing the skyline like a painting. At the head of the table sat Akiyama Reiko, poised, hands folded, eyes unreadable. When Malik entered, the room seemed to pause. The investors glanced at him with disdain, whispers rustling like paper. Reiko didn't flinch. She looked at Malik directly. "You came," she said softly, in Japanese. Malik bowed, as he had in the lobby. "You asked." A faint smile tugged at her lips. "Then let us begin." He slid into the chair beside her, every eye in the room heavy on him. Inside, his fear roared like a storm, but his voice, when he opened his mouth to translate the first clause, was steady, precise, unshakable. For the first time, Malik realized he had crossed a line he could never return from, and for the first time, he didn't want to. The suite was quiet except for the soft scrape of paper as Malik and Reiko leaned over the table. Two thick folders lay open between them, one stamped in English, the other in Japanese. Malik's eyes moved back and forth, line by line, his brow furrowing deeper with every comparison. At first, the texts looked identical, polite legal phrasing strung together in neat columns. But then the fractures began to show. Clause 4.3. In Japanese, all proprietary technology remains the sole property of Akiyama Innovations. In English, all proprietary technology shall be co-managed under the Joint Operating Agreement, with oversight delegated to U.S. partners. Malik's heart kicked. He ran his finger under both sentences, then tapped the paper. "This isn't a mistranslation. Someone rewrote it." Reiko's gaze sharpened, her hand pausing mid-note with her fountain pen. "Show me." Malik circled the passages, then flipped to the next page. Clause 6. Arbitration jurisdiction. Japanese version, Tokyo District Court. English version, Delaware Chancery Court. His jaw clenched. They moved the entire legal battlefield. Reiko sat back slowly, her eyes narrowing with cold fire. Not error. Intent, the silence between them carried weight. Malik's pulse thudded as he felt the magnitude of what they'd just uncovered. This wasn't about cultural confusion. This was about theft, hidden in plain sight. He closed the folders gently, careful not to smudge the ink. "Miss Akiyama, they've been trying to strip you piece by piece, hoping you wouldn't notice." She studied him across the polished table. For the first time, her usual composure cracked just slightly. Not weakness, but calculation, as if measuring the risk of trusting him. Then she spoke in Japanese, her voice low, deliberate. "I don't need a translator anymore." Malik held her gaze, steady. "I need a witness." The words settled like a challenge, and Malik felt something shift inside him. His father's voice echoed in his chest. "Fighting doesn't mean you win, it means you don't kneel." He nodded once. "Then I'll stand with you." Reiko's lips curved into the faintest smile. She closed the Japanese folder with a decisive snap. "Good. Because when this comes to light, they won't only fight me, they'll fight you too." Malik's throat tightened, but he didn't flinch. "Let them." Kenji entered quietly, his steps soundless on the carpet. He placed a tablet on the table, eyes flicking between them. "Miss Akiyama, the next session begins in 20 minutes. The investors are restless." Reiko didn't look up. "Let them wait." Kenji hesitated, then bowed. "As you wish." He left, closing the door softly behind him. Malik let out a slow breath. They'll deny everything. They'll claim it's a draft, a clerical mistake. Reiko stood and walked toward the window, the city glittering beneath her like a restless ocean. Mistakes do not repeat across 4 clauses. This is calculated, and when men calculate, they leave trails. She turned back, her eyes sharp, resolute. "We will find the trail, and when we do, I will not be the only one speaking." Malik felt the weight of her words sink deep. He had been overlooked, dismissed, shoved back into shadows his entire life. But now he was being asked not just to step into the light, but to hold it steady against men who thrived in darkness. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for the folders again, not from fear, but from certainty. "Then let's finish reading." They bent together over the pages, line after line, revealing more tampering, small substitutions, buried terms, clauses tilted in favor of U.S. investors. Each discovery was another nail in the coffin of trust. By the time they reached the last page, the evidence was undeniable. Malik closed both folders, his palms firm against the covers. Reiko exhaled softly, almost like a prayer. Now the question is not if we confront them. It is when Malik looked at her, steady, resolved. "Then let me be there when you do." For a long moment she said nothing. Then she nodded once, sharply. "You already are." And in that silence, Malik understood. This wasn't just her fight anymore. It was theirs. The hallway outside the staff lounge hummed with the usual background noise. Carts rolling, radios crackling, hurried footsteps. Malik was about to push his mop bucket into storage when a soft voice stopped him. "Malik?" He turned. Claudia Miles stood there, crisp in her HR blazer, her eyes flicking nervously up and down the corridor. She clutched a folder so tightly the edges bent under her grip. "You shouldn't be talking to me," Malik said carefully. He'd learned the hard way that even eye contact with management could spark suspicion. Claudia stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Neither should you be in boardrooms." Yet here we are. She pressed the folder into his hands. "Read this when you're alone." Malik hesitated. The paper was warm from her touch, heavy with implication. "What is it?" Claudia's jaw tightened. "Proof. HR logs, memos. Enough to show Victor Lang and Richard Hale aren't just careless. They're working together." She exhaled shakily. "And if I'm right, they've been preparing this for months." Malik's heart pounded. He wanted to ask why she was giving it to him, why risk her position, but her eyes told him everything. She was tired of watching corruption win. "Don't mention my name," she whispered. "If they trace it back, I'm finished." Before he could answer, she turned and walked briskly away, heels clicking down the hallway like a metronome of fear. Malik slipped into the janitor's closet, the only place where silence belonged to him. He flicked on the dim bulb and opened the folder. Inside were scanned HR notes, email transcripts, and signed directives. His eyes darted across the lines, each word hitting like a blow. Meeting request between Victor Lang and Richard Hale. Finalize strategy for ownership transition. Draft memo. Ensure Akiyama's requirements appear in Japanese text only. Adjust English contracts accordingly. Internal chat log. If the girl or anyone raises questions, shut them down. Stall until signatures are secured. Malik closed his eyes. This wasn't sloppy translation. This was theft written in corporate ink. His father's voice rose unbidden in his memory. A union hall in Detroit, rough wooden tables, men with tired hands. His father standing at the front saying, "They'll always tell you it's just business. But when they take your sweat and call it theirs, that's theft." Days later, his father was blacklisted from construction jobs across 3 counties. Malik opened his eyes, the sting of that memory settling into his chest like iron. He traced the words on the memo with one calloused finger. This was the same playbook, only shinier. Steal from the unseen, bury it under jargon, and laugh while the world applauds. He shoved the papers back into the folder and pressed it to his chest. His breath came hard, controlled, as if holding back a storm. A knock rattled the door. Malik tensed, but it was only Kenji, standing with his usual calm. His eyes landed briefly on the folder. He didn't ask, he only said, "Miss, Akiyama will need you tomorrow. Conference room B, be ready." Malik nodded, slipping the folder under his jacket. "I'll be there." When Kenji left, Malik leaned against the shelves, the smell of bleach and linen pressing around him. For the first time, he understood the scale. It wasn't about one contract, one meeting. It was about a machine designed to strip Reiko of her life's work and hand it over to men who thought she couldn't fight back. And now, without meaning to, he had stepped onto the battlefield. He folded the folder shut with deliberate care. No mop, no bucket, no uniform could hide what he carried now. "This isn't translation," he whispered to himself. "This is war." The bulb flickered above him, and Malik knew there was no turning back. The janitor's closet was dim, its single bulb casting a tired yellow glow across the shelves of detergent and stacks of folded rags. Malik closed the door behind him and set the folder down on the small metal sink. For a moment, his eyes drifted to the corner where his mop leaned against the wall. The wooden handle was worn smooth from years of hands gripping it, pushing it across marble floors that reflected lives far above his own. The gray strands at the end were frayed, heavy with bleach stains that no scrubbing could erase. Malik stepped closer, running a hand along the handle. He remembered his first night here, barely 20, pockets empty, telling himself this was temporary. But months turned into years, and the mop became the measure of his worth in everyone else's eyes. He lifted it upright, holding it like a staff, like something ancient and heavy with memory. His reflection stared back from the metal cabinet door. Dark skin, tired eyes, the uniform that made him invisible to men like Richard and Victor. "This mop," he whispered, his voice steady in the silence, "may not open doors." He gripped it tighter. "But my voice will." The words echoed, bouncing off tile and steel, louder than he expected, as if the closet itself agreed. Malik leaned the mop back into its corner, but he didn't look away this time. He saw it for what it was, a symbol of the silence they expected from him, the silence his father had refused, the silence that had cost his family everything. His chest rose with a long breath. He wasn't just carrying bleach and buckets anymore. He was carrying truth, and truth had a way of cutting through marble floors, glass walls, and boardroom tables sharper than any weapon. Outside, the hotel buzzed with its usual rhythm, but Malik stayed still for a moment longer. He looked at the mop one last time, and instead of shame, he felt a strange sense of strength. Let them laugh, let them sneer. He wasn't here to shine their shoes or polish their illusions. He was here to speak, and once spoken, his words would not be mopped away. Malik picked up the folder again, squared his shoulders, and stepped back into the hallway, ready to face whatever came next. The janitor's closet smelled of bleach and old soap, a place Malik knew better than any corner of the hotel. He shut the door behind him and leaned against it, exhaling the weight of everything he'd just seen. The forged clauses, the folder Claudia slipped into his hands, the realization that this wasn't just sloppy paperwork, it was theft dressed in polished language. His eyes fell on the mop standing in the corner, same one he'd dragged across marble floors for years. The wooden handle was scarred with tiny cuts, the ragged head stained gray from endless scrubbing. To everyone else, it was nothing but a tool of silence, a symbol that Malik belonged on his knees, wiping away footprints that weren't his. He stepped closer and gripped the handle. For a moment, memories surfaced. His father, walking home from a construction site with calloused hands, telling him, "They'll try to make you small, son. Don't let the work they give you decide your worth." Back then, Malik hadn't understood. Tonight he did. He raised the mop like a staff and stared at his own reflection in the metal sink. His janitor's uniform was wrinkled, his shoulders tired, but his eyes were alive, sharper than he'd ever seen them. "This mop may not open doors," he whispered, voice low but steady, "but my voice will." The words rang louder in the tiny room than he expected, as if bouncing back to remind him they were true. For the first time, he didn't feel chained to this closet. He felt like he was standing on the edge of something larger, something he was no longer willing to ignore. He set the mop back in its place, but differently now, not as a burden, but as a reminder. They could strip his badge, suspend his shifts, call him boy until their throats went dry. But they couldn't erase the truth he carried. Malik picked up the folder again, holding it tight to his chest. The mop would stay here, but his words, his courage, would walk with him straight into the halls they never meant him to enter. And this time, he wasn't going back. The ballroom had been transformed into a press hall overnight. Rows of cameras lined the back wall, their red recording lights blinking like watchful eyes. Reporters jostled for position, microphones raised, the air tense with the hum of anticipation. At the podium stood Akiyama Reiko, poised and silent, her presence as sharp as the ink strokes she had painted the night before. But when she stepped aside, all eyes widened. Beside her was not a polished corporate translator, not a consultant from some firm with marble offices. It was Malik Carter, still in his janitor's uniform, though his collar was pressed, his stance unshaken. He stood at her side with the quiet defiance of a man who knew he wasn't supposed to be here, but was here anyway. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Victor Lang shot to his feet from the investors' row, his voice cutting across the room. "This is insane. A janitor." The word echoed like a slap. Reporters scribbled, cameras zoomed. Reiko didn't flinch. Instead, she looked at Malik, nodded once, and began speaking in Japanese. Her words flowed, measured and deliberate. Malik listened, his brow furrowed in concentration, then translated with precision, each syllable rolling clear and firm. Madame Akiyama states that her company submitted identical contracts in both English and Japanese. What was presented, however, was not identical. Key clauses were deliberately altered in the English version. Intellectual property rights shifted. Arbitration moved from Tokyo to Delaware. This was no accident. This was deception. Gasps. Pens froze mid-scribble. Reporters leaned forward, murmurs turning into a storm. Flashbulbs lit the stage. Victor's face went pale, then red. "He's making this up," he barked. "You can't trust a janitor with million-dollar contracts." Malik cut in, voice firm, unwavering. "Then perhaps you should explain why the Japanese version protects Miss Akiyama's ownership, while the English version hands it to you." He lifted a document Reiko had placed in his hands. Cameras zoomed in on the pages, the highlighted discrepancies plain as day. The room exploded with noise, questions hurled from every direction. Who changed the contracts? Is this corporate fraud? Were U.S. investors complicit? Reiko raised her hand, and the chaos quieted. She spoke again in Japanese, her tone steady, eyes sharp. Malik translated, "We came here for partnership. Instead, we found betrayal. But integrity is not negotiable. From this moment forward, Akiyama Holdings will no longer work with parties who manipulate silence into profit." The silence that followed was heavier than the noise. Then, a single reporter in the front row shouted, "Mr. Carter, what do you have to say? You're just a janitor. Why are you here?" Malik looked straight into the cameras, his voice calm but cutting. "Yes, I mop floors. But today, I clean the lies too, and I will not stay silent while they rewrite truth." A murmur turned into applause from the back rows, journalists first, then even a few staff members pressed against the wall. Cameras flashed wildly, the image of a black janitor exposing billion-dollar fraud beside a Japanese CEO burned into lenses that would beam it across the world. Victor lunged forward, shouting, "This is slander! Shut this circus down!" But the damage was done. The scandal had already erupted, its flames fed by every microphone and every camera in the room. Reporters swarmed the podium, shouting over each other. "Is this evidence enough for legal action? Will there be arrests?" "Mr. Carter, are you testifying against your own employers?" Malik didn't answer. He didn't need to. The truth was already louder than any denial. Reiko closed her folder with deliberate calm, placed a hand lightly on Malik's arm, and guided him from the stage. Behind them, the press exploded into frenzy, questions overlapping, shutters firing like gunfire. In the hallway beyond, the noise of the press faded into a muffled roar. Malik's heart still hammered, but his face was composed. Reiko glanced at him, the smallest trace of a smile curving her lips. "They underestimated you," she said softly. Malik exhaled slowly, gripping the folder tighter. "They always do." And with that, the doors behind them burst open again, the storm chasing after them. But for the first time, Malik didn't feel like prey. He felt like the storm itself. The hallway outside the press hall pulsed with chaos. Reporters shouting, cameras flashing, the hum of scandal echoing down every corridor. Malik followed Reiko and Kenji toward the elevators, his grip still firm on the folder of evidence. His chest thudded with adrenaline, but his steps were steady. Then Richard Hale stormed out from a side door, his face blotched with rage, tie askew, sweat staining his collar. He blocked the hallway, eyes blazing at Malik. "You," Richard spat, his voice trembling with fury. "You people never know your place." The words cut through the air like broken glass. Staff passing by froze in their tracks. A bellboy stopped mid-step, mouth slightly open. A housekeeper turned sharply, clutching her laundry cart, her eyes wide. Everyone heard it. Malik didn't move. He didn't blink. He only looked at Richard, his gaze steady, unflinching. The silence that followed was heavier than shouting. Malik's eyes locked on Richard's, calm and deliberate, as if holding up a mirror. Richard's words dangled in the air, ugly and exposed, with nothing to hide behind. Richard's chest heaved, his fists tightening at his sides. He expected an outburst, a denial, anything to let him win the moment. Instead, Malik gave him nothing, no anger, no defense, just that steady gaze. The silence stretched. It was unbearable for Richard, but not for Malik. For Malik, silence was strength. Reiko stepped forward, her presence sharp as steel. She spoke in Japanese, her voice quiet but edged with authority. Malik translated softly, never breaking eye contact with Richard. She says, "When a man must shout to prove his power, he has already lost it." The words landed like a blow. Gasps stirred through the hallway. A security guard shifted uncomfortably, glancing between them. Richard's face twisted. He took a step closer, lowering his voice into a hiss meant for Malik alone. "Don't fool yourself. You think a mop and a few fancy words make you her equal? When this burns down, you'll be back in the closet where you belong." Malik still didn't respond. His silence deepened, his eyes never leaving Richard's. And in that silence, every witness understood what Richard didn't. The power had already shifted. Reiko turned slightly, resting her hand on Malik's arm. "We're done here," she said in English this time, sharp enough for everyone to hear. She guided Malik past, her heels clicking against the marble like a gavel striking down. Richard stayed frozen in the hallway, breathing hard, trapped in the wreckage of his own words. Around him, staff whispered, eyes averted, but no one dared step closer. Malik didn't look back. He didn't need to. The silence had spoken louder than anything he could have said. Malik sat in the dim light of the service lounge, the echoes of Richard's words still clinging to him like smoke. He rubbed his palms over his knees, forcing his breath into rhythm. That was when the door creaked open and a man stepped in. Slender, middle-aged, sharp eyes that missed nothing. "I'm Oda," he said simply, his accent clipped, his tone quiet. "Miss, Akiyama sent me." Malik rose, cautious. "Why?" Oda laid a small recorder on the table. "Because you're not just a translator anymore. You're a liability to them, and liabilities are erased." The words hung heavy. Malik's pulse quickened. "You have proof?" Oda pressed play. Static hissed, then Victor Lang's voice spilled out, low and deliberate. "The janitor is a problem. Eliminate his access quietly, no noise, No trail. Richard's muffled voice followed, bitter, shaken. If he keeps talking, we lose everything. I'll get HR to bury him. You handle the rest. The recording clicked off. Silence pressed in. Malik's jaw tightened. Hearing it was different from suspecting. They weren't just trying to discredit him. They wanted him gone, invisible again. Oda slid the recorder closer. It's time this leaves the shadows. The door opened behind them. Reiko entered, her presence filling the room without effort. She studied the two men, her eyes sharp, and then she spoke softly in Japanese. Malik translated without hesitation. She says the time for whispers is over. This must go to the International Council. Malik's throat went dry. If we do that, they'll come after us harder. They'll bury me completely. Reiko's gaze didn't waver. She stepped closer, her voice steady. Malik translated again, each word cutting clean. Then let them come. A witness with nothing to hide cannot be erased. Oda nodded faintly, as if confirming a silent agreement. The council is convening in 2 days. Present this, and it won't just be rumor. It will be record. Malik held the recorder in his hand, its weight heavier than any mop he'd ever pushed. For years he'd been invisible in the halls of this hotel, known only by the squeak of his cartwheels. Now, every step he took carried the risk of being silenced forever. But he remembered the press conference, the cameras flashing, the roar of questions that could no longer be ignored. He remembered Richard's fury collapsing under silence, and most of all, he remembered his father's voice. Don't kneel. He lifted his eyes to Reiko. Then I'll stand with you. All the way, her lips curved into the faintest smile, but her words were steel. Malik translated for himself this time, his voice unwavering. We fight with truth, and truth will not kneel. Reiko turned toward the window, the city sprawling in glittering lines of light. Behind her reflection, Malik stood with the recorder clutched in his hand, the evidence that could tear down the empire of lies. There was no going back. The battle had shifted from quiet halls and secret folders to the global stage, and Malik knew, when the council met, he wouldn't just be the janitor who translated. He would be the witness who could not be silenced. The chamber of the International Investors Council was nothing like the hotel boardrooms Malik had grown used to. It was larger, older, lined with dark wood and portraits of men who had shaped industries with pens instead of hammers. Dozens of delegates sat in tiered rows, translators in booths above, cameras discreetly tucked into corners. The air hummed with formality and danger. At the center stood a single podium. Behind it, Reiko Akiyama, and beside her, Malik Carter, his janitor's uniform pressed but unmistakable. Whispers rippled the room. Some scoffed, some leaned forward with curiosity. The chairman's gavel tapped once. Proceed. Reiko bowed her head slightly, then gestured for Malik to step forward. His chest tightened, but his feet carried him. He set the recorder on the podium, pressing play. Victor Lang's voice filled the chamber, low and damning. The janitor is a problem. Eliminate his access quietly. Richard's voice followed. If he keeps talking, we lose everything. I'll get HR to bury him. Gasps broke across the chamber. A delegate from Germany whispered fiercely to his neighbor. The Chinese delegate scribbled notes furiously. The weight of the words could not be dismissed. Malik let the silence after the recording stretch. Then he leaned toward the microphone. His voice was low, but it carried. I was that janitor. I cleaned your floors. I emptied your trash. I passed through your halls invisible. He lifted the contracts, Japanese in one hand, English in the other. And I read the lies you signed. The room stilled. In Japanese, Ms., Akiyama's company kept its ownership. In English, that ownership was stolen. This wasn't error, it was design. And when I exposed it, they tried to erase me the way they erase truth, quietly, with paperwork, with threats. He set the contracts down with deliberate force. His eyes swept the chamber, meeting delegates who rarely met the eyes of staff. I don't ask for power. I don't ask for status. But if this council allows silence to cover theft, then integrity means nothing. And if a janitor cannot speak the truth here, then none of you are safe from lies. A murmur surged through the room, growing into a roar of voices in multiple languages. The chairman struck the gavel again, demanding order. Victor Lang rose abruptly, his face pale but defiant. This is a farce. He has no credentials, no authority. He's a janitor paraded to shame us. But before he could continue, Reiko stepped forward, her voice slicing through his protest. He has more authority than you, Mr. Lang, because he listened, because he saw what you buried, and because he chose truth over silence. The chairman raised his hand. The matter is clear. We will vote one by one. Delegates pressed their buttons. The screen above lit up with results. Green overwhelming red. By majority, the council moved to suspend Victor Lang and Richard Hale, pending investigation. The gavel struck final. So ordered. Victor sank back into his chair, fury simmering under his skin. Richard's shoulders collapsed, his eyes darting anywhere but toward Malik. Malik exhaled slowly, the weight on his chest lifting just enough to breathe. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. Around him, the murmurs were no longer whispers of doubt, but of recognition. For once, the janitor hadn't been silenced. He had been heard, and the council chamber would never forget it. The council's decision echoed in Malik's chest long after the gavel fell. By the time he returned to the hotel, his uniform still crisp from the hearing, his body felt heavy, like he had walked miles carrying more than just folders and evidence. The service elevator rattled down to the basement, and when the doors opened, the familiar smell of bleach and detergent rushed in to greet him. The janitor's room was alive in a way he'd never seen before. The usual clatter of mop buckets and the hiss of washing machines had gone silent. Instead, his co-workers stood waiting, housekeepers in faded uniforms, dishwashers with tired eyes, men and women from Jamaica, El Salvador, Nigeria, Vietnam. People who spoke a dozen languages but shared the same invisible status in the hotel's glittering tower. When Malik stepped inside, the room erupted. Hands reached for him, pulling him into tight embraces. Shoulders pressed against his, voices shook with emotion. Some laughed, others cried openly, their relief raw and unashamed. "You did it, brother," one whispered in a thick accent. "They saw you." "They saw all of us," another said, her tears streaking down a weary face. Malik tried to smile, but the lump in his throat caught him. He had stood before investors, billionaires, councils, but this moment, this gathering in a fluorescent-lit basement, was heavier than them all. At the back of the room, leaning on her mop like a cane, stood Marsha Green, the oldest of the staff, her hair silver under the buzzing lights. She had scrubbed these floors since before Malik was born, her hands bent from years of labor. She shuffled forward slowly, her eyes glistening. She reached out, cupping his face in both of her calloused palms. Her voice was hoarse but steady. "You didn't just clean floors, baby." Her words broke into a whisper, thick with pride. "You cleaned our names." The room fell quiet. Malik's chest tightened, his eyes burning as he bowed his head against her hands. For years he had believed the mop was a symbol of invisibility, but in this moment it became something else, a banner of dignity reclaimed. Marsha pulled him into her frail arms, and the others closed in, forming a circle. Dozens of tired, unseen workers holding one another like family. The air carried no bleach, no chemicals now. Only the warmth of people who, for the first time in years, felt seen. Malik lifted his head, looking around the circle. "We were never just the help," he said quietly, but the words carried. "We've always been the foundation." "And foundations don't break," the staff murmured agreement, some nodding, others wiping their eyes. For a few fleeting minutes, the basement wasn't a place of rags and buckets. It was a sanctuary. When the circle broke, Malik walked back to his locker. He set the folder down and placed his mop against the door. The same mop. He had once cursed. Now it stood tall, a reminder of the line he had crossed and the silence he had broken. Around him, the others slowly returned to their stations. But something had changed. Shoulders straightened, heads lifted. For once, they weren't just cleaning up after the powerful. They were standing beside one of their own who had spoken truth to power and refused to kneel. Malik closed his locker and exhaled deeply. For the first time, he didn't feel like a janitor trapped in the basement of someone else's empire. He felt like a man who had given his people back their names. The final meeting was held in a smaller chamber, far from the flashing cameras and the roar of the press. Reiko Akiyama stood at the head of the table, calm as ever, her gaze steady as she addressed the handful of executives who remained. Beside her sat Malik, his uniform jacket folded neatly on the chair, his hands clasped on the polished wood. When the agenda was finished and the last signatures placed, Reiko turned toward him. Her words came in Japanese first, deliberate and measured, before she shifted into English so all could hear. From this day forward, Mr. Carter will serve as our official liaison between Akiyama Holdings and its partners here in the United States. A ripple went through the room. Some blinked in surprise. Others nodded quietly, already accepting the inevitability of what they'd witnessed. Malik swallowed hard, the weight of the moment pressing against his chest. He stood slowly, pushing the chair back, and moved to the front of the table. His voice was low but unshakable. I was a janitor. I mopped floors and emptied trash. I was invisible until the truth made me impossible to ignore. Titles fade. Integrity stays. That is the only credential that matters. No one interrupted. Even the most skeptical of executives lowered their eyes, as if conceding something larger than contracts had been settled in that room. Reiko inclined her head toward him, her lips curving into the faintest smile. Then let us begin a future, built not on silence, but on respect. Hours later, Malik walked through the hotel lobby. The same marble floors he had scrubbed until his hands cracked gleamed beneath his shoes. He carried no cart, no mop, only the quiet dignity of a man who had refused to kneel. Guests turned to watch him. Staff straightened, some bowing their heads slightly as he passed. Even the concierge, who once brushed him aside, stepped back respectfully. It was subtle but unmistakable. Deference, acknowledgement, something he had never been granted before. Malik didn't slow his stride. His shoulders were steady, his eyes forward. He had not sought applause, nor titles, nor the shallow respect of those who once dismissed him. What he carried now was heavier, but truer. As he crossed the expanse of the lobby, sunlight spilled through the high glass windows, catching him in its glow. For the first time, he was not the janitor, slipping by unseen. He was the man everyone had to notice, and in that quiet, undeniable moment, the story of Malik Carter became more than survival. It became legacy. In the end, Malik walked through the same lobby he once scrubbed clean. But this time, every step carried respect that could not be mopped away. Not because he won a title, but because he chose truth when silence was easier. Maybe that's the lesson we carry tonight. What the world ignores in us today may be the very thing that saves it tomorrow. If this story spoke to you, share it with someone who needs the reminder that dignity is never invisible. And if you want to walk with us through more stories of justice and resilience, you know where to find us. Thank you for listening. And remember, titles fade, integrity stays.